Yeah, it works. Yeah, and you should speak in microphone and ask people also speak in microphone.
Один, два, все. Працюю. Доброго дня, друзі, або вечора. Я не знаю, в нас вечір, мабуть, в Вашингтоні трохи інший час. Я Володимир Шегус, виконавчий директор ISAR Ednannia, і вітаю вас в Домі громадянського суспільства, де відбуватиметься презентація дуже цікавого дослідження, про яке вже не перший рік говориться в Україні, але не лише в Україні, і у всьому світові. Але на початку нашої зустрічі хочу сказати, що сьогодні ми працюємо двома мовами – українською і англійською. Тому, якщо треба вам переклад з будь-якої на будь-яку мову з перечислених, будь ласка, візьміть там обладнання, і ви зможете розуміти, про що сьогодні будемо говорити. Тож, ще раз вітаю вас на цьому заході. Знаєте, слово локалізація, я думаю, що це не дуже українське слово, і тим не менше ми хочемо говорити про те, що на місцевому рівні дуже багато акторів, дуже багато організацій, дуже багато систем і механізмів, які розвиваються, і все більше і більше ми можемо і потужні робити тут на місцях, де би це не було в Україні. Це Україна, в іншій країні то інша країна і таке інше. Тож, чому ми сьогодні говоримо про цю тематику, чому ми говоримо про те, що це важливо, от якраз цьому і буде присвячена і презентація, і дискусія. І ми дуже раді, що люди, які сьогодні будуть говорити на цю тематику, довірили нам тут в Домі громадянського суспільства зібратися і зібрати вас, бо ми як організація, яка вже фактично 32 роки працює в Україні, ми є і організацією-посередником такої intermediary support організацією, ми є і українською організацією, як я жартую інколи, але це правда, районна в місті Києві громадська організація ISAR Ednannia, яка підтримуємо щорічно по 500-600 організацій і співпрацює з майже 15 тисячами представників різних організацій в Україні. Тож тема локалізації і економічної обґрунтування і інше дуже-дуже для нас чутлива і важлива, і будемо раді з вами продовжувати обговорювати цю тематику. Але нашою спільною цільовою аудиторією є як і громадські організації, організації громадянського суспільства, так і міжнародні організації, і програми технічної допомоги, і багато інших. Всі ті, хто можуть зробити більш ефективним надання послуг і забезпечення належної якості життя людей в Україні, бо ми говоримо про Україну. Дуже вам дякую. Дуже дякую і передаю вам мікрофон.
Moderator, thank you so much. Good evening, everyone. My name is Hardin. I'm the Vice President for Programs and Policy at Refugees International. I'm incredibly excited to be in Kyiv today, back here in Ukraine, to launch this report, Passing the Buck, the Economics of Localizing Aid in Ukraine. Refugees International has been engaged in Ukraine since 2014, but we really became much more deeply involved in the wake of the full-scale invasion in 2022. And at the time, what we witnessed were this extraordinary upsurge of humanitarian action by volunteer networks, by existing NGOs, by CSOs, and by local authorities throughout the country. And they came together to launch, in our view, what has been one of the more effective, immediate humanitarian responses in some time. As time passed in the subsequent months, you saw the international aid architecture become organized and begin to stand up inside of Ukraine. And then billions of dollars began to flow through the system, primarily through the international aid architecture, to Ukrainian organizations and others. But Ukrainian organizations saw very little of this money come to them directly. And so one of the things that we have really centered on and really focused on since we got to Ukraine is trying to figure out how to get much more of that assistance directly to Ukrainian organizations. And so to this end, I really want to recognize first Nicholas No, who's with us today. Thank you, Nicholas, for leading our work on this here in Ukraine. It's been incredibly valuable. We all know that localization, that getting aid and locally led development and locally led humanitarian response is much more effective. It's faster, it's more equitable. Local organizations and Ukrainian organizations are trusted by their communities. We, as international humanitarians, have a moral obligation and duty to transfer power to local communities and to local CSOs to implement, to meet the needs of their own communities. The question is how to do that. The challenge, though, up until now, is though we've known it's the right thing to do, we haven't always had the data to prove that it is the smart and more efficient thing to do. However, Courtenay, Cabot, Venton, going back to 2022 and 2023, put together a seminal study called Passing the Buck, where she looked at global data that was available to look at the question of efficiency. And one of the extraordinary results of that study was that it became clear that there was 32% cost savings to be achieved for donors at a global level if funds could flow more directly through local organizations. This study is an attempt to ground truth that global review in the Ukraine experience. And I don't want to steal Courtenay's thunder here, but I'll just say that a lot of the Ukraine experience bears out the findings of that global study. In fact, we estimated that if 25% of all aid coming into Ukraine, and this is the 25%, which is what the international community has committed to, at a global level, were to flow directly through Ukrainian organizations, donors could save close to $250 million in 2 years. That's $250 million that could be reallocated to meet the needs of Ukrainians throughout the country. The report makes clear also that we, as the international community, have a lot of work to do, but it also underscores some of the places where there have been some very impressive innovations. The Ukraine Humanitarian Fund has done a really impressive job of changing their systems and figuring out how to get more money directly to Ukrainian organizations, and trying to figure out how to take that effort to scale across Ukraine, and then in other contexts are something we all have a lot to learn from. Courtenay will walk us through her findings shortly. But before we get there, once we actually go through the findings, we're going to be joined by an extraordinary panel of humanitarian leaders to talk about the findings. Daria Rybalchenko is the chairperson of the Board of National Network of Local Philanthropy Development and a network of charitable organizations united to promote local philanthropy and volunteerism. And we've had the privilege to work with you now for a couple of years and really grateful for the partnership. Lizz Halanen is the Advocacy Policy Advisor for Humanitarian NGO Platform in Ukraine, and she was formerly worked for Christian Aid, DRC, and Mercy Corps across Asia and a number of global policy issues, including hunger. And Ksenia Ginchuk is the Deputy Director of the NGO Resource Center. The center is engaged in advocacy and capacity building to make the response of civil society, NGOs, and government more effective. Until recently, the center was on the board of the UHF. And finally, but not least, Lizz Harrison has been working with partnership-based international NGOs for more than 15 years. She's the program manager for CAFOD's humanitarian response here in Ukraine, a very close partner. And Lizz has conducted a study for the UK's Disaster Emergency Committee that worked with local and national actors to identify the best options for supporting local organizations here in Ukraine. Once we've heard from the panelists, we will open up the floor to questions in person and online. And before I start with that, though, I would very much like to thank Ednannia for welcoming us here today. Your organization is quite impressive. It's extraordinary the work you've done in terms of building capacity of local civil society across Ukraine, and I can't think of a better place to get this conversation started. And I'd also like to thank the Center for Disaster Philanthropy for sponsoring this study. They've been an amazing partner in leading local response and localization, not just here in Ukraine, but around the world, and we're very grateful for their partnership. With that, over to you.
Thank you, Hardin, and thank you everybody for welcoming me here. It's been amazing to be here. My name is Courtenay Cabot Venton. I'm the executive director of an organization called the Share Trust. We work entirely to support community-led action, but we do a lot of that work through shifting systems, by shifting power, process, and funding at a global level to support local initiatives more directly. My background is that I'm an economist, so I'm a little bit of a nut for any numbers where I can try and dig in on some data and add some value to how we think about how we do international development. I have spent 20 years of my career advising bilateral donors, INGOs, and local actors as well on the most cost-effective ways to do the work that we do so that we get the maximum bang for the buck. It has been a huge privilege to get to do this study for Ukraine, and huge thanks to Refugees International for partnering with us on this, and also CDP for funding this study. I just want to reiterate that. So I'm going to walk you through the findings. I'm going to give you a high-level overview of the numbers. I am more than happy for anyone who is a fellow data nerd who wants to go deeper, just let me know, and I will schedule a call with you online so that I can explain the numbers in more detail. But hopefully this will give you a flavor for what we found. One of the great privileges of this study is that we have been able to get data from a wide range of organizations through the country-based pooled fund, the Ukraine Humanitarian Fund. So we were able to review 51 projects funded through the CBPF in 2023, either directly or as sub-grantees. The direct grants equate to $55 million in our sample, which is equivalent to 30% of total funding going through the CBPF in 2023. So a very reasonable sample for what was funded. Our analysis included 5 UN projects, 5 INGO projects, and 8 LNGO, you'll see me use that acronym a lot, local NGO projects, so local actor projects, in our analysis. And we were given detailed budgetary data for all of these projects under the requirement that we didn't directly identify who anybody was, but presented rather an anonymized overview of the cost structures in each of these categories of implementing partners. I'm going to walk you first through the data analysis, what did we see in the data, and then I'm going to talk you through the cost efficiency analysis that we undertook with that data. So some of the interesting things that came out of the study. This slide shows the average budget by implementing partner. So you have UN and UN subs, they're sub-grantees. You have INGOs and the INGO sub-grantees, and you have LNGOs and their sub-grantees. What's really interesting that I take away from this slide, there's 2 things. The first is that the INGOs and their subs and the LNGOs and their subs have quite similar cost profiles in terms of what they're implementing. The UN has a much greater focus on a very heavy focus on supplies, in other words, procurement within their direct budgets, and they're largely relying on their downstream partners for their staff costs to help implement. We also saw things like doing wraparound services like protection services alongside aid delivery. The other thing that's really important to notice in this, PSC is project support costs. That's what's referred to as overhead costs or indirect support costs. Every organization has a different acronym. It's really important because it's the lifeblood of how you can build your capacity in your organization to have all of the management and systems that you need to be able to report well on the work that you're doing. All of the INGOs and all of the LNGOs were doing full pass-through of their overhead costs to their downstream partners. None of the UN organizations in the sample that we reviewed indicated that they were doing pass-through of overhead costs. And you'll see in a minute that this comes through as a very clear recommendation from the study. Not that you don't do pass-through. We were also able to analyze the average grant size by implementing partner. This is really important because in a lot of the countries where I work, oftentimes the local ecosystem is made up of so many very tiny actors that it's very hard to channel funding to them directly. What's important about Ukraine is that at least in this sample that we reviewed, the LNGO budgets that we reviewed were actually receiving grant sizes on average that are larger than the INGO grant size and not that different to the UN average grant size. So this suggests to me that there are local actors in the system that have the capacity to be absorbing larger scale grants. We were also able to analyze monthly staff costs. I will emphasize that this is staff costs, not salaries, by implementing partners. So everything that it costs to bring on board a staff to implement a program in a country. you can see that we had quite a few data points. So we have international staff at the UN, international staff at an INGO, national staff at the UN, national staff at an INGO, and then different breakdowns of national staff. Here you have the average staff cost for national staff at an LNGO sub. So this is a very small organization typically. They're not a prime or a direct sub to a UN or an INGO. What's important here is that the staff costs at the for international staff at the UN in Ukraine are making approximately 15 times the national staff at the smallest level. I think probably what's the more interesting point is that the international staff at the UN and the international staff at the INGO are often the very same people, but it costs about 2.5 times to have an international staff member at the UN as it does to have an international staff member at an INGO. We also were able to do a little bit of analysis looking at specific project budgets to try to understand kind of how things were passing through. And as I mentioned, this study was done on the condition that we would not name specific organizations, but that we could present any data so long as it was anonymized. And we felt like this was a really interesting example of how the system could change. So in this instance, this bar is a UN agency delivering a large proportion of their grant, 68%, going to a sub, this was a local organization in this case, and their budget is almost entirely made up of supplies. They were delivering dignity kits, and that was the majority of this 81% of the budget that they were procuring locally. There were also a number of dignity kits being procured by the UN agency for the same price, and I'm able to see in the budgets exactly what's included in those dignity kits. It was very much the same sets of items for similar costs. But in this instance, as you can see again, the UN is able to charge the 7% overhead cost on the entire budget without any pass-through. So they're effectively getting overheads on a large amount of procurement that is being done by a local partner. And I think that this raises a lot of really interesting conversations. There are a lot of spaces where it makes the most sense for the UN to be doing large-scale procurement. I don't think any of us would argue with that. But in a humanitarian response, there's a lot of different kinds of procurement, and in some place like Ukraine, there are parts of the procurement feed that could easily be run directly by local actors. And this really indicates why it's so important to kind of look very carefully at the whole supply chain and who's in charge of doing what, so that we aren't then layering overhead costs on something that a local actor could be supplying directly. So key takeaways in terms of the overall data analysis. Clearly the cost structure between INGOs and LNGOs and their respective LNGO subs is not that different, but that cost structure at the UN does look quite different. That's not necessarily good or bad, it's just something that helps us to learn about the way we're structuring our projects and how we might do things differently. As I mentioned, the average grant size for the LNGOs is actually more than the INGOs. So there are many LNGOs in this ecosystem who are perfectly capable of absorbing direct funding. Again, lots more to unpack there. How much more could be absorbed? What does that look like in terms of how it's passed through? But a really good conversation starter. The UN, at least in the budgets that we sampled, and at least on paper, is not passing through overheads to its subgrantees. The only exception was where a UN agency was subgranting to an INGO partner and did pass through overheads. Otherwise, all subgrantees were local partners and were not receiving any overheads. All INGO agencies, with the exception of one in Ukraine, did indicate full pass-through of PSC, of overheads. And then finally, on the staffing costs, international staff costs at the UN are ranging between 5 times national staff at the UN and 17 times national staff at those smallest LNGO subs. Sorry, I said 15 times earlier, it was 17 times. International staff costs at INGOs range between 2 times national staff at INGOs and 8 times national staff at an LNGO sub. So now I'm going to take you through the cost efficiency analysis. What we did was we used all of that data to then try to estimate what would it look like if we were to shift more funding to local intermediaries. I would highlight that we're looking specifically at local intermediaries. There is a global data point that suggests that the overhead cost of distributing hundreds of individual grants to many local organizations is as much as 50% of the budget. So part of what we're trying to do in the next set of conversations with this study is to understand what are the different types of intermediary structures that could help to get more funding to local actors. But by shifting those intermediary structures to a local entity, we would be able to realize the cost efficiency gains that I'm going to show to you. So our methodology, we took the total staff costs that I just presented to you. We actually did quite a big cleaning of the staff costs because within the breakdown of all of the different staff, there were not always the same types of jobs, and we didn't want to compare apples with oranges. So what we did was we took the 7 keywords that showed up consistently in the job titles for international staff, things like manager or specialist or lead, and we tagged only jobs that had the same job titles in the national staff, so that we were excluding, for example, drivers and security guards who would have pulled down that average. That was true in the data that I just showed you. We then calculated the average monthly salary for different job types, as you saw above, and we used that to calculate what the savings would be if jobs were moved from international to national. I just want to highlight, though, that what we did not do was say, hey, let's move all international staff at the UN to $879 a month and save a ton of money. That's not the point of this study. We used equitable staff costs and overhead costs, only adjusting for the cost of living, using World Bank data, to be able to adjust. And so the final point was more in this range around what are national staff currently making at the top end of what they would make at a local organization. And we assumed that international staff costs were readjusted to what would be considered a well-paid national staff at an LNGO. Okay, I gave you the key slide before I finished explaining. As I said, we adjusted the overhead costs using World Bank purchase power parity, which is a cost of living indicator specifically for Ukraine. So that tells us what it costs to run a head office in New York as compared to a head office in Kyiv. And then we also added in, we know from global data that the 7% overhead cost is not representative of what it costs the UN or an INGO to run their organization. We know from global data that HQ overheads at the UN are typically 11.4% on average, and at INGOs they are 13% on average. These are from large data sets reported by those organizations themselves. So we added the additional overhead that's being raised back in the US to support the overhead costs at HQ for that additional amount above the 7%. And then we split that proportionally between staff costs and overheads using the same analysis that we used for the data within the budgets to adjust it to what it would look like if it was run locally. So the upshot, we were able to analyze $21.1 million of UN funding with an equivalent staff and overhead cost of $4.6 million, and $11.8 million worth of INGO funding with a $3.9 million staff and overhead costs. Just to highlight that the funding at the UN is about double the INGO funding, but with the same level of staff and overhead costs. That's because there's so much procurement in the UN budgets, whereas the INGOs were typically doing more programming in terms of things like GBV and safeguarding and all of these kinds of things. When we converted those amounts to local rates, we were able to estimate savings of $3.3 million, or a 72% cost efficiency on staff costs and overheads, just taking those budget lines at the UN, and savings of $1.8 million, or a cost efficiency of 47% of total staff costs and overheads at INGOs. So just to highlight that the 72% cost efficiency just on the staff and overhead cost line indicates that there's significantly more cost efficiencies to be made by shifting funding at the UN, which makes sense given the cost structures that we just presented. When we combined all of that data, the overall cost efficiency that we were able to estimate on the entire budget was 15.5%. So for every dollar that goes from an international organization intermediary to a local intermediary, we would realize a cost efficiency of 15.5%. That's a very significant number. We then looked at the total funding that went through the country-based pooled fund in 2023. we can see that they already deployed 20% of their funds to local actors, and using that cost efficiency, we were able to estimate that the UHF has already realized cost efficiencies of $5.5 million in a single year by channeling more funding to local actors. And if they were to take the remainder of the INGO and the UN funds and shift 25% of that remaining amount to local actors, we would see an additional cost efficiency of 5.9 million. These are really important numbers because those are big budget lines, especially for local actors who are trying to meet needs on the front line. So the idea is that those cost efficiencies should be channeled back into helping build the ecosystem of local actors and also being able to extend the response to more people who need help. We then also did turn our attention, as Hardin alluded to at the start of the presentation, to the total humanitarian response funding that has gone to Ukraine in 2023, and that's estimated for 2024, that total 6.6 billion. If 25% of that funding were deployed to local actors using the 15.5% cost efficiency, we would see $256 million in cost efficiencies in 2 years. That's a huge amount of funding. Take this slide with a grain of salt. It has a million questions to unpack underneath it. Are there local actors that can take on $1.7 billion worth of funding in Ukraine? What would that look like? How would it be distributed? How do we do that in a way that makes sense? But I think the point speaks for itself, that it is high time to have the conversation around how that happens, because we need these humanitarian responses all over the world. And we also were lucky enough that the country-based pooled fund in Nigeria gave us the same set of data to analyze, and we found almost identical findings to what we found in Ukraine. So this is not only in Ukraine, this is the world over, that there is a huge potential to allow our response to be much more sustainable, to be much more cost efficient, in a world where needs are rising faster than any of us can even catch our breath. We need these cost efficiencies to be in place so that we can start to see needs met in the rising number of crises globally. Key takeaways, and then recommendations, and then I'll hand it over to the panel. So, key takeaways. Based on an evaluation of actual project data representing 30% of total funding via the UHF, we can deliver 15.5% cost efficiency by channeling that money to local partners. These savings are most pronounced at the UN, with a 72% cost efficiency on salaries and overheads as compared to 47% at the INGOs. Both of those numbers are big. Both sets of actors need to find ways to shift. A key finding from this analysis is that UN agencies need to be required to pass through PSC or overheads in full to their downstream partners, given that INGOs and LNGOs are already doing that consistently across their projects. The UHF has been an amazing partner for us in all of this and has already realized significant cost efficiencies because they are really trying to do things differently by deploying more funds to local actors. And if we were to deploy more, as we said, there would be a very significant uptick in funding within the system. Key recommendations coming out of this study, but we're very keen for the conversation with all of you to hear how we can take this forward. Donors and international multilaterals such as the UN need to establish full transparency on cost structures for delivering assistance. This is the first time in 10 years that I have been able to get UN project data. It needs to be transparent. This system requires everybody. It requires the UN, it requires INGOs, and it requires local actors, but we cannot get balance in the system and play to each other's key strengths unless we have these transparent and honest conversations around how the system is working. Donors should stipulate or mandate that all UN agencies and INGOs operating in Ukraine are required to pass through full overheads to their Ukrainian partners. This is only the tip of the iceberg. We were able to look at funds through the UHF, but we are very aware that there are much larger budgets that are going through core funding mechanisms where these rules also need to be considered and applied. Donors should fund innovation and scale up pooled funds as a mechanism to shift more funding directly to local actors. Pooled funds are a starting point, but they're a mechanism that is already in place in the system and where we can see multiple pooled funds around the world really trying to do things differently. So we need to lean in and see how we can trailblaze in that space. The analysis presented here, as I just emphasized, should not be used to support arguments to defund the international aid architecture. What we are saying is that we need to lean into each other's complementary roles, introduce separation of functions, and much more balance within the system. Identifying, strengthening, and building local intermediary structures is key to realizing these gains. As I said, the idea is not that we start to channel $1.7 billion to 500 individual local organizations. That would be a huge task and very inefficient. Rather, we want to find ways that we can lean into intermediary structures that can help to then channel funding out to smaller local organizations. And the last is that we really need to lean in as well on work to assess the benefits of local response. This is the cost efficiency side of the argument. So we want to present the cost effectiveness side of the argument and really start to understand better how and where and in what contexts and in what ways and to what magnitude are local actors able to deliver a more effective response, because that's the other piece of the puzzle. And that's an area that has been documented multiple times in the global literature as being woefully understudied and someplace where we really need to lean in to do more. So with that, I am going to hand back over to you, or shall I go? Yeah, back over to Hardin.
Thank you very much. Amazing presentation. It was really, I mean, I've read the report, but even getting to see the briefing over again, it's always so striking, like the key findings from the report. I'm very impressed. Thank you for that. Daria, maybe I can turn to you first. And just in addition to getting your general impressions of the findings of the study, the recommendations, there's also this key question that Courtenay surfaced over the capacity of Ukrainian organizations, whether at the national level or even the local level, to absorb, say, a shift of 1.7 billion. You work with these organizations all the time across Ukraine. What's your impression?
My first impression is that we can manage to work with this money. Але я перейду на українську. Все ж таки, мені буде простіше говорити українською. По-перше, я впевнена, що українські організації зможуть працювати з цими грошима і управляти їми. У нас громадянське суспільство розвивається вже дуже давно, і різні організації працюють на різному рівні. Навіть коли у нас є недокомунікація між гуманітарним сектором і сектором громадянського суспільства, яке було в Україні дуже давно, і відповідно стається так, що є потенціал, є організації, які можуть це робити, але вони не докомуніковують до гуманітарного сектору, і відповідно відбувається те, що одні про одного не знають, і не відбувається цей меч між тими, хто хоче опрацьовувати гроші, і тими, хто може їх прийняти на локальному рівні. Але моє таке загальне враження від репорту – це те, що, напевно, це те, про що ми всі здогадувалися, але в нас не було цьому ніколи підтвердження. Коли ти говориш з локальними організаціями, всім очевидно, що зарплати в ООН набагато більше, ніж зарплати в локальної організації. Всім очевидно, що в національної організації зарплати будуть менше, ніж в організації, яка працює в якомусь конкретному регіоні. Але тепер ми маємо дату, яку ми можемо бачити і робити аналіз. Один із таких кейсів – це те, що бенефіціарам, людям, яким ми намагаємось допомогти за ці гроші, їм трошки все одно, хто їм допомагає, міжнародна організація чи локальна організація. Але вони бачать інформацію про те, що новий транш допомоги прийшов в Україну. І виникає питання в них: окей, а якщо новий транш прийшов допомоги в Україну, чому ми досі знаходимося в тій ситуації, коли ми чогось потребуємо? Чому досі ми там маємо їздити від шелтера до шелтера, ходити за допомогою і так далі? І коли незалежні дослідники починають питати цих людей, а як ви відчуваєте, чи використовуються гроші доцільно, ми дуже часто можемо чути питання корупції, що, напевно, гроші не доходять, що, напевно, вони десь осідають по карманах і так далі. Але ми бачимо, що це все ще досі питання, як ефективно використовувати ці гроші. Як ефективно їх донести від того, що вони прийшли в Україну, до того бенефіціара, який перестане страждати від того, що він знову змушений переїжджати від шелтера до шелтера. Так, і мені здається, що за цією датою ще стоїть дуже багато історій. Історій, коли Courtenay показувала закупки, і цікаво, що закупки були однакові по складу і по ціні плюс-мінус. Але ми маємо дуже багато локальних історій, коли закупки локальних організацій були набагато більш якісніші і дешевші, ніж закупки міжнародних організацій. Ми маємо історії, коли... Теж один з таких акцентів, на що я хочу звернути увагу. В презентації і в цифрах було, що ООН-агенції не передають гроші своїм сабгрантерам на непрямі витрати, але також вони там щось 1% всього грошей на обладнання. Тобто локальні організації, які реалізують проекти, вони використовують своє обладнання. І це без оплати амортизації цього обладнання. І це невеликі гроші, коли ти використовуєш ноутбук, принтер чи щось таке. Але це ж роздача гуманітарної допомоги. І це значить машини довести гуманітарну допомогу до бенефіціара, це значить обслуговування складу, обслуговування складського обладнання. І це про ті незліченні локальні ресурси, які локальна організація вносить в проекти, які ніким не оцінюються. І мені здається, що нам теж варто це акцентувати, і це як додаткова вартість тих проєктів, додаткова цінність тих проєктів, які реалізовуються локальними організаціями через те, що вони вносять додатковий локальний ресурс.
Great, thank you very much. Lizz Harrison, can we turn to you quickly? You've been operating in this space for over 15 years. CAFOD is spending a tremendous amount of time. It's a huge part of the work here to be working with local organizations and Ukrainian partners and to figure out how to make that partnership as meaningful as possible. What stood out to you from this report? And then particularly when we get to the prescriptive element about the recommendations, where do you see the most opportunity for turning those things into reality in the Ukrainian context?
So, first to say, what a fantastic report. Thank you, Courtenay. And secondly, to say, I think the thing that really struck me was on this PCR pass-through. And I might just frame it because, like you say, we have been talking about this in different countries. Overheads, indirect cost recovery, project support costs, they're all the same thing. Essentially, they're any costs that are not directly specific to the project, but support the effectiveness, the efficiency, and the safe, crucial here, safe running of the organisation. So it's pretty clear not providing any to local partners is unfair, but it's also completely counter to many of those commitments made at global level, right? Many of those UN agencies will have signed up to the Grand Bargain. Many of the international NGOs that support that also. But it was good to see that they are passing through, at least, international NGOs. A recommendation from the report that DEC commissioned that I worked on with Dimitra and Katerina, I think they're listening online, was that UHF adopt a fair overheads policy for sub-implementing partners. So it's exactly what you're saying here in the recommendations. That was late in 2022. So it's not a new recommendation, but I have heard that they have put in place a scoring mechanism which includes how they assess proposals and whether they are passing on project support costs in this case. I think as well it's useful to refer to the IASC guidelines on the provision of overheads to local and national actors. That was developed through lots and lots of research, again at global level, again in 2022. Many UN agencies that they mapped had no policies on sharing, on passing ICR project support costs. And INGOs often didn't have anything written formally, but practiced it in policy. Sorry, put it into practice, even if it wasn't written in policy. At that time, there were two exceptions. I worked for one of them, CAFOD. I used to work for one of the other ones, Christian Aid. Apparently, since then, there are two more, Save the Children and Oxfam, so good to note them. But maybe that is partly what we need to do as well, is to highlight those that are not doing that and celebrate those that are. And therefore continue to push for that to be put into policy at UHF, but also for all donors as well.
Let me just push you a bit here. Like, how would you do that? How would you actually mandate that inside of donor regulations?
Put it in policy.
Right.
So your budget must include either, so it depends on how you do it, right? Either you can do it above the line, so 10%, let's say, ICR, indirect cost recovery for partner. You could do that proportional on the budget that they manage, or as CAFOD has a policy for, any indirect cost recovery we receive. So for example, DEC provides 7%. We share 50-50 with our partner.
Thank you very much. Ksenia, this is fascinating, right? Because your organization has actually been on the board, right, of the UHF. Take this in whatever direction you'd like to go, but love to hear your general observations, but then also a bit about what that has been like being a locally based organization on the board and what the experience has been in terms of driving policy that's designed to try to mitigate some of the downstream negative impacts that we're seeing here.
We have been on the board, and it was a pleasure to be there. It's good also that people are changing. We have other organizations now coming in, perhaps other perspectives, but a lot of the same advocacy points and recommendations. We also receive, obviously, UHF funding, and we work with local partners. And вибачте, я теж хотіла українською, якщо можна, я просто забула про це. Вибачте, я перейду на українську. Я хотіла сказати, що ми отримуємо фандинг від Українського гуманітарного фонду, а також, що важливо, ми працюємо з локальними партнерами в декількох наших проєктах з UHF. І що я маю на увазі, коли кажу, що ми працюємо з локальними партнерами, це організації, які працюють частіше за все в одній області просто. Це не великі національні організації, а ті, що дійсно локальні, іноді працюють в одному районі, іноді в одному місті і так далі. І та ситуація, що я бачу, дуже класно бачити таку перспективу загальну трошки картину цього семплу. І я хочу сказати, що наші локальні партнери, вони ближче до ось того мінімального рівня, який був вказаний у звіті. Їхні зарплати виглядають як цей мінімальний рівень зарплат. Не просто зарплати, які average, середній рівень, яка нам показувала Courtenay. Якщо прочитати звіт, подивитися, є така табличка порівняльна, де є максимальні, мінімальні і середні. І от наші локальні партнери, через те, що вони менші організації, вони на цьому мінімальному рівні зараз. І також, коли ми говоримо про середній розмір гранту, який розглядався, ми теж не близько до цього середнього рівня, напевно, ми десь там на мінімальному рівні. Тобто, потрібно і важливо розуміти, що Гуманітарний фонд для України – це такий фонд, в який не так-то просто потрапити. Особливо це було не просто в 2022 році. У них, на жаль, не було достатньо команди і достатньо ресурсів, щоб прийняти весь той потік організацій, які хотіли мати доступ до цього фінансування. У них були і залишаються, на жаль, важкі процеси перевірки. І дуже багато організацій навіть не мають доступу до цього фінансування. Тобто, що мені здалося, що ті організації, на які ми дивимося, потрібно також розуміти, що це, напевно, ті найбільш потужні організації, це ті організації, які найбільше коштів якимось чином порівняно з своїми колегами, і особливо порівняно з локальними організаціями, вони мають в своїх проєктах. Тому просто також для нашого розуміння ми працюємо, і UHF дуже позитивно реагує, трошки повільно, але все ж таки є позитивні суви і щодо оверхедів, про які говорила Лізз, і щодо due diligence процесів і процедур. Ми дуже цьому раді. На жаль, ситуація така, що ми втратили дуже багато цього часу. Локальні національні організації тоді, коли це було найбільш потрібно, не мали доступ до великого, дуже, до цих можливостей, до великого фінансування і так далі. Тому просто для контексту, я думаю, що це важливо. Я також дивилася на глобальний звіт, над яким працювала Courtenay, в якому також більш широке таке поле і cost efficiency визначалось. І я думаю, що якщо ми подивимось поза UHF, ми побачимо, напевно, картинку, яка ближче до загального, до глобального дослідження, яке було проведено. Ось. Просто для мене це важливо, тому що це, щоб ви також це побачили, тому що це ситуація, яку бачу я, і це реальність для дуже багатьох локальних партнерів, з якими ми працюємо. Для них реальність це нормальна зарплата $300, і для них реальність, що іноді їхній партнер або фонд може урізати їм бюджетні кошти. І якщо їм кажуть урізати бюджетні кошти, де вони їх урізають? Дуже часто в зарплатах. Тому що ти не будеш урізати собі оперативні витрати, ти потім не зможеш зробити свої активності. Тому, на жаль, це дуже важливо для локальних організацій. Але ще один момент важливий, який я бачила в рекомендаціях, дотичний також до накладних витрат, до overhead cost, це те, що є рекомендація навіть або практика робити кошти на накладні витрати для маленьких організацій локальних більшими, тому що у них більші потреби на ці штуки, на будування процесів, структур, можливо, на покупку якогось обладнання, якого у нас немає, все таке. Або як альтернатива, що я можу запропонувати, це просто включити, зробити легальними і нормальною практикою включати в бюджет деякі такі кошти. Тобто кошти, наприклад, банально на бухгалтерську програму, кошти на стратегічну сесію, кошти на ще щось, що, на жаль, або просять виключати з бюджетів іноді, або наші партнери, якщо ми їм не скажемо, вони не знають, що це можливо. Їм ніхто ніколи до цього не казав, що так, ви можете включити ці кошти. І хочу просто також поділитися таким фактом з попереднього проєкту нашого з UHF. Ми питали всіх наших локальних партнерів, а на що ви потратили оверхед? І на що ви потратили ці накладні витрати? І дуже багато з них казали те, що ми б хотіли, щоб вони в майбутньому включали в бюджети. Багато з них сказали, ми купили сейф, ми купили програму якусь, щоб там у нас працював веб-сайт, або щоб у нас працювала пошта, або щоб у нас був сервер, який ми використовуємо для інформації. Тобто дуже багато витрат, які насправді дотичні до проєкту або важливі для того, щоб вони безпечно працювали як організація. І просто також, чому це важливо, щоб ми не думали, що там накладні витрати – це щось, вони будуть собі дозволяти екстраординарне. Це дуже-дуже важливі, реальні, потрібні речі. Дякую.
Yeah, I think that's a super important point about how to think about overhead costs, right? These are not like special gifts that you get as a local organization. These are the things that are absolutely required to build your capability, that if they're necessary in international organizations, of course they're necessary at the local level. Lizzie, just before I come to you, I want to ask Courtenay to follow up on one thing. You raised this point, Courtenay, about how if you look behind the UHF, right, and you look at some of the other UN agencies that are implementing directly, perhaps that like this might just be the tip of the iceberg. And you mentioned this briefly in your presentation, but I wanted maybe we could give you an opportunity to reinforce why you think that is the case.
Yeah, so when we did the global passing the buck study, the reason I did the study is because I sort of miraculously came across a whole bunch of data on UN and INGO cost structures at a global level that I simply didn't know existed. So I had this incredible opportunity to pull those pieces of data together. They were in about 8 different peer-reviewed studies of quite large data sets. And when we looked at the normal structure for some of the much larger funding streams that go through UN and INGOs, they typically have multiple levels of pass-through. The uniqueness about the pooled funds is that because they're relatively rapid and smaller grants, they tend to go from the UN to implementation or to a set of downstream LNGOs, or from the INGO to LNGOs, and that's it. It's a much simpler pass-through model. And so the main difference when I compared the two models for why we saw the 15.5%, which still is an incredibly, incredibly high level of cost efficiency to fund in a program, compared with the 32%, is because we're pretty sure it's because it's a much simpler set of pass-throughs. So one of the things that we'd be really keen to do is to then see what does that look like when we look at some of these larger funding streams that are going through these more complicated structures, and how could those be simplified to allow for more money to actually reach people on the ground. So you are absolutely spot on in your assessment on that.
Great, thanks very much for doing that. Lizzie Hallinan, you live as a leader on the platform, on the NGO platform, you live with a foot in both worlds of both the Ukrainian organizations, but also the international NGOs. What are the elements of this that are most striking for you, and how do you think this sort of information will be absorbed inside of the platform, both just in terms of reflection, but then in terms of action moving forward?
Oh, thanks. That's a great question, and glad to be here with all these amazing women who can speak to this issue, which is very close to my heart. I think, so I'm an advocate, and I think as an advocate, we always love to have an incredible piece of evidence like this, where we can cite all of this fantastic math that Courtenay has done, because we know a stat is really what we need at the top of the page to make our point. So from that perspective, I think from our group of advocates within the platform, we will really appreciate having this to lean on. And I think, yeah, like Hardin said, we have both international NGOs and Ukrainian NGOs in our platform, and we see them coming at this issue in quite different ways. And I think one of the great ways to think about this idea of pass-through of ICR, pass-through of overhead costs in a very practical way, where people, localization nerds like me, will say things about shifting the power, and this is a very practical way of shifting the power. It's paying for something that you want. You pay something for what it's worth. So I think putting it in quite practical terms for program people is useful. And one thing we often see with our INGOs is they don't always know what other INGOs are doing necessarily, and some are quite out front, like some of the ones that we've mentioned, and other ones are still working internally. And it is a big process internally, like Lizz was saying, at the global level, to put a global policy in place. But I think, I know there's donors in this room, so as a call to them, I think what this paper also shows very clearly is if the donor asks for it, the INGOs will come. And you have seen, almost all the INGOs in Courtenay's study, without it even being a requirement, following along to a criteria recommendation, essentially, and providing this ICR and figuring out how to do it on a country level. And that's something that it can only help them to kick it up to their HQ. So we do appreciate the UHF for putting some positive nudge in place, and I think that really helps the NGOs. And then for the Ukrainian NGOs, I mean, Ksenia was just giving all these amazing and honestly a little bit maddening to listen to examples of times when either a Ukrainian NGO felt they couldn't get the support that they needed to do whatever it was, whether it's for things that are quite actually direct program costs, let alone this 7% of heaven that you might like to have to build out your organization. And so I think one thing that I know we talk to our Ukrainian NGO members about a lot is asking for it. And this frustrates me slightly because often when they ask, they get it. And it makes me think, if you're an INGO sitting there with that 7%, you could just offer it. And that's another thing that I think we talked to both sides of our groups about that, how they can move forward on that issue, on the pass-through issue. Thanks.
That's a great example of how you can use the power of a platform to have those conversations facilitated and try to say, let's move beyond putting the onus on the Ukrainian organizations to ask for the pass-through and just go ahead and say, this is going to be part of what we're doing moving forward. Before we go to audience questions, Courtenay, if you could think back to your recommendations, and maybe the one in particular on intermediary structures, what are the components of that you feel are most sort of promising in the Ukraine context from what you've seen, and places where we should think about really putting an emphasis from donors to international organizations to local organizations?
So it's a tough question to answer only because I do a lot of work in a lot of different countries, and it means I'm never really a specialist on any country. And so I've spent the last 2 days just absorbing from many of you in this room what you would like to see. And I think I wouldn't want to sort of bypass those observations. Some of the places, though, where I'm hearing positive noises and where I'm seeing opportunity, so much of our work is around helping to bridge bilateral funding because it accounts for so much of official development assistance. How can we bridge that with local organizations? And the reality is, for every single bilateral, and to be honest, for almost every single US philanthropy, it is very hard to do many individual small grants. And I think that the pooled fund, for what it's worth, where we see pooled funds trying to do things differently, it's a starting place. The fact that there's a lot of momentum for the pooled fund in Ukraine to be nationalized and to think about a really different way of doing things is a huge opportunity. And as I said in the presentation, it's a mechanism that's already funded by bilaterals. It's much easier for them to lean in that space than to introduce a new type of intermediary. Having said that, we've been doing a lot of work globally at trying to look at what are some of the alternative types of intermediaries, particularly because what we don't want to do is to replace 10 INGOs with 10 national NGOs who are better than the INGOs, but not that much, because what consistently happens is that we have to feed our budgets and our infrastructure and all of this. And so we need to be able to really bring in, through collaboration, by breaking down competition, the many, many smaller organizations who are never going to have the opportunity to access a pooled fund, as you were saying, because it's so hard. But we don't want to make all the Ukrainian organizations meet pooled fund requirements. That would be crazy and onerous, and everybody would stop worrying about their communities and instead worry about due diligence. So I think thinking about how do we introduce structures, and what's amazing about the Ukrainian ecosystem, at least as I've learned about it, is that so many of the people here who are speaking, but also in the audience, represent alliances of groups of organizations that are really trying to find ways to collaborate to do things differently. And I think exploring where in those spaces could we start to create alternative structures. I will say I do a lot of work with FCDO, and I also have a lot of exposure with USAID. And I'm hearing from so many USAID offices a real intention to try to realize the 25% goal. But they're like waiting, like, what can I fund? How can I make this happen? How can we do this in a way that's going to be effective? And so I think a key onus coming out of this conversation is to really figure out how can we put together several ideas that can be funded, and that's going to require, really honest conversations with our bilateral colleagues as well around what is possible and how do we make that happen. So it's a sort of roundabout answer, but.
No, that's great. That was fantastic. Thank you. In fact, if we've got just a minute more, I want to put very quickly, give the floor to Daria and to Kyiv to say a bit about, of these ideas around a pooled fund or alternative intermediary structures, what makes the most sense in the Ukrainian context? Daria, maybe start with you, and then, or...
Ну, ми давно про це говоримо, і в Альянсі ми про це говоримо. Має бути не один пулфанд, має бути регіональні пулфанди, які би могли закривати ці потреби і ці проекти саме з цими організаціями, які мають зарплату $300 і роблять неймовірні речі. Так, це диверсифікація влади саме через диверсифікацію пулфандів по Україні. І це мають бути як регіональні пулфанди, так і, можливо, тематичні пулфанди, які би були спрямовані, там, не знаю, для організацій, які працюють з людьми з інвалідністю, або для організацій, які працюють з дітьми, які втратили батьків. Тобто мають бути тематичні і регіональні. Тобто це та позиція, яку ми активно промотуємо і займаємо. Ми самі зараз намагаємося імплементувати пулфанд в Україні з фінансуванням Disaster Emergency Committee. Це непроста робота. Це, правда, вимагає дуже багато ресурсу організації. Дякую, Лізз. Дуже багато ресурсу організації, дуже багато адвокації, дуже багато змін. Але ми, працюючи над цим проєктом, ми знаємо точно, що це щось, що міняє підхід до видачі фінансування, щось, що більш адаптовано до українських реальностей. Ну і так, я можу сказати, що в Україні є потенціал розвивати і допомагати таким організаціям, які вже мають досвід регрантингу. Їх насправді дуже багато по регіонах. Ми колись з Caritas сиділи і розмовляли, що і наші організації, і організації Caritas вже роблять ці малі гранти для місцевих ініціатив. Тобто зараз є можливість взяти ці організації, які мають перший досвід, підсилити їх, допомогти їм допрацювати якийсь свій потенціал і давати їм вже управляти коштами, які би вони могли розподіляти на місцеві ініціативи. Я вважаю, що нам треба точно рухатись більш активно, більш продуктивно в цьому руслі. І да, я думаю, що в Альянсі ми будемо з цим далі працювати.
Я абсолютно підтримую Дарію і вірю і в їхній фонд, і, можливо, інші, які будуть, які зараз в процесі формування. Згодна абсолютно з тим, що це має бути не один фонд, тому що у нас дуже багато організацій, і неможливо знати всіх, неможливо скоординуватися з усіма, тому важливо декілька каналів мати. Також закликаю, звісно, донорів звернути увагу на ці ініціативи. Я думаю, дуже важливо мати фонд, яким керує національна організація, українська організація. Але що хотіла б ще додати, це інший, можливо, підхід. Він не настільки відрізняється, але, наприклад, якщо ми говоримо не про фонди, то я вважаю, що релевантно говорити про культуру якісного, хорошого, чесного партнерства. Ми говоримо про це багато, але або довго вже, але знову ж таки, як і з усіма іншими штуками, прогрес доволі повільний. Що ми говоримо, якщо ми вже бачимо, що, на жаль, деякі актори не є хорошими партнерами для локальних маленьких організацій, або вони закриваються що на деякі рекомендації, на деякі глобальні вже угоди, скажімо так, то, напевно, треба підходити трошки по-іншому і запроваджувати деякі практики хорошого партнерства, робити їх більш обов'язковими, можливо, запроваджувати їх в політики, можливо, в договори або щось інше. Але загалом, загалом промоутити, да, підсвічувати практики хорошого партнерства серед усіх організацій, в тому числі маленьких, які, на жаль, деякі не мають хорошого досвіду роботи або того, що ми б хотіли, щоб вони мали. Да? Це, наприклад, теж доволі очевидні, можливо, речі, які можуть допомогти локальним організаціям. Це, наприклад, ділитися повною проектною заявкою і бюджетом, повним бюджетом, своїм бюджетом, показувати їм, щоб вони розуміли всю картину. Це не просто так, це, в принципі, дає їм розуміння свого місця і також загальних цілей проєкту, загальної системи координації всередині і поза, можливо, організаціями, різні типи цих систем, якщо у них є декілька таких хороших партнерств і так далі. Це, в принципі, буде розвивати, підвищувати спроможність організації, давати їм розуміння, а про що вони можуть попросити, а про що не можуть. І також, знову ж таки, це позбуватися оцього ієрархічної моделі, підходу, в якій, на жаль, дуже багато організацій не наважуються про щось попросити або сказати чесно про свої потреби. Це також важливо. На жаль, ми бачимо, і Дарія знає, і ми, і взагалі багато організацій з Альянсу, ми говоримо про це вже дуже багато, але, на жаль, знову ж таки, не всі чують наш голос, або не всі наважуються це робити все одно. Але, знову ж таки, якщо ми позбуваємося цієї ієрархічної структури, ми виходимо трошки на один рівень, ми виходимо на відкриту комунікацію, на комунікацію на рівних, люди будуть це робити. І загалом ми дуже багатьох проблем таким чином можемо позбуватися. Тому це також така інша трошки модель, хоча я вважаю, що воно все має працювати разом і ще, напевно, багато інших ідей, багато інших хороших практик, про яких, можливо, ми не згадали сьогодні.
Я хочу додати ще одну штуку, дуже практично і дуже маленьку. Допомагайте для донорів і для міжнародних організацій, допомагайте локальним складати бюджет. Вони дуже часто не знають, який рівень зарплат вони можуть закладати. Вони дуже часто не знають, що вони можуть закласти зарплату, яка буде більш сталою для їх команди. І так само, як Ксенія говорила, що там дійсно можна закласти зарплату на тренера для їх команди, який би допоміг їм розвинути якісь спроможності. А друге, комунікуйте і викладайте умови, рекомендації на сайт або до заявок, як заповнювати бюджет. Якщо ви не можете проконсультувати, викладайте рекомендації і пишіть відкрито, що можна там подавати overhead cost. Бо запитати завжди можна, але дійсно в нас дуже великий цей power distance, як це називається, індикатор в Україні. Нам, як українцям, дуже важко інколи попросити і переступити якийсь цей момент влади. І вони можуть просто стіснятися, не знаю, відчувати себе не в позиції сили, запитати про це. Тому, напевно, відкритість, прозорість комунікації щодо того, що можна в бюджетах і що не можна в бюджетах, це має бути основне. Одна така коротка історія. Я колись спілкувалася з організацією в Одесі, яка не знала, що можна закласти оренду складу в бюджет.
That's amazing. They couldn't include the warehouse in the budget? Okay, so what we're hearing from all of this are big calls for, more sort of like transparency and authentic partnership and accompaniment as we develop these budgets and we go through these processes. So, only good things happen when more of those two things happen. So thank you very much. I want to turn now to some questions from the audience. I also want to acknowledge the presence of the leadership of the Alliance of Ukrainian CSOs. Mila is here with us. Mila, do you have any questions or observations you'd like to offer at this stage? Or?
I have gratitude because it's very interesting. And Я маю вдячність, власне, дуже велику і до всіх учасників, до того дослідження, яке було презентовано, тому що дійсно ми багато речей знаємо, ми багато про що говоримо, але це дослідження показало, що слона не можна як приховати у маленькій кімнаті. І воно має під собою вже дані, оприлюднені дані, якими можна оперувати. І ми сьогодні вже мали розмову, що дійсно в Україні не вистачає іноді даних підтверджених, якими ми можемо оперувати, на чому ми можемо будувати основу і далі рухатися. Тому я не хочу займати дуже багато часу, я дуже вдячна. І Courtenay, це було дуже, дуже сильне і дослідження і сама промова. Я дуже вдячна всім спікерам, які підтримали цей саме своїми висновками, своїми баченням. І дякую, звичайно, і Ніколас, і дякую Refugee International за таку взагалі ініціативу. Я думаю, це дуже круто. Дякую дуже.
Okay, who else has got a question? Please. Don't be shy. So please introduce yourself and then ask the question. Thank you.
Believe me, introduce myself, it's my favorite thing. Саша, платформа неурядових організацій, також дуже вдячна за те, що залучали нас до консультацій, до цього процесу. У мене коментар, рефлексія, питання, все зразу. Перш, це, мабуть, прийшовши з національної організації до платформи, координаційного органу, я можу сказати, що локалізація відбувається, бачу прогрес, хоч і повільний, дуже радію цьому. Однак у мене питання до Courtenay, запитання до дівчат-учасниць панелі щодо географічної складової. Тому що насправді сьогодні я можу сказати, що локалізація відбувається тільки при фронтовій території. Маючи членів платформи, які базуються Черкаська, Вінницька область, вони не мають доступу до цих фондів. UHF, попередня локація минулого року, дуже чітко таргетувала прифронтові регіони. Тому питання до Courtenay, чи була географічна складова, питання до дівчат, до Даші про пул-фанд, які будуть географічні регіональні критерії, ну і загалом, хто може поділитись рефлексією саме щодо географічної складової локалізації, коли ми говоримо про гроші. І, можливо, не тільки про гроші. Дякую.
That's a great question. So, in essence, to what extent is localization a regional phenomenon? That was something that showed up in your data?
So it did not show up in our data. And just because, you know, my kids might watch the recording, I'm taking notes on my phone on the questions. I'm not looking at my phone whilst I'm at a presentation, in case you try to hold me to that. There was not the ability to geographically break out the analysis, because whilst it was a really good sized data set, it wasn't enough to get that granular. I think, though, this is where the point around being able to get some of these larger budgets. And in other countries, we have done a fair bit of work of mapping local actors to try to understand where are they, what sectors are they in, and how is money moving to them. I think that could be a really interesting next step off of this study. And then you ask the panel.
Так, я можу відповісти. В нас в пулфанді ми не ставимо ніяких регіональних пріоритетів. Ми намагаємось покрити всю Україну і взяти партнерів з різних частин України. Це був один з наших пріоритетів, коли ми обирали перші 10 учасників. Але так, проблема регіональності дуже велика, дуже важлива, і дякую, Саша, що акцентувала на неї увагу.
Great. Any other observations? Ксенія?
Я хочу дякую за питання, тому що це також тема, яку варто підіймати. В нас минулого року були партнери в проєкті UHF, які були з областей, які не знаходяться в прифронтових територіях. На жаль, зараз ми не можемо, не здатні включити відповідно до пріоритетів, які були надані після цього. Це дуже велика проблема, те, що я чую від деяких міжнародних партнерів, що буде розвиткове фінансування, да, development funding буде заходити, і вони сподіваються, що він буде допомагати цим організаціям виживати. На жаль, поки що вони не бачать ніякого цього фінансування. Якби не знаємо, коли воно буде. Не сподіваємося, що скоро, тому що від цього дійсно залежить, скільки організацій в центральній і західній Україні у нас залишиться. Тому що вони не зможуть проіснувати довго без фінансування. Тому це дійсно дуже важливо. Ми говорили в дорадчій раді UHF про це. Ми піднімали це питання. На жаль, це глобальна проблема не тільки UHF, а так, всього, да, гуманітарного фінансування. Да, я вважаю, що це дуже важливо, якщо будуть такі фонди, як той, про який говорить Дарія, або тематичні фонди, які можуть не спиратися на географічний, на якісь області, на якийсь розподіл по регіонах, тому що це будуть фонди про глобальні проблеми, про проблеми, які присутні в кожній області в Україні.
It's great. Thank you, Sasha. Great question. Mila?
Я просто хочу до цього додати і підтвердити, власне, це, тому що ми зараз маємо розмову із західними регіонами, в тому числі маленькими містами, але я хочу сказати, що це дуже... Вони не сидять, склавши руки. Зараз вони намагаються зорганізувати величезну конференцію, як фандрайзити за кордоном напряму маленьким організаціям. І я просто закликаю навіть наші підтримати цю ініціативу, тому що дійсно дуже важко залучати кошти на території, Саша підтримує, де немає війни. Мається на увазі, де вона далеко. Але тут важливо зараз підтримати ті ініціативи, які виходять якраз звідти. І це одна із них. Так, дякую.
Great. Thank you, Mila. Here.
Доброго вечора усім. Юлія Дідюк-Колосова, Хельвітас. По-перше, дуже дякую вам за вашу презентацію. Дуже рада бачити Ксенію як нашого партнера тут. Адже зараз Хельвітас в Україні впроваджує проєкт одноіменний, який називається «Локалізація». Ми працюємо в східних областях. Це дійсно дещо контриб'юти до того, що зазначили зараз мої колеги, про те, що дуже багато локалізацій відбувається саме на war-affected територіях. Водночас у мене виникає питання, наскільки локалізовано ми діємо в цих регіонах, де локалізація дійсно вже розпочалася, але зараз, працюючи з мікрогрантами, ми спостерігаємо таку ситуацію, де нам в заявках люди, представники організації зазначають, що до нас не доходить допомога, тому що у нас замало бенефіціарів, тому що у нас немає політик, тому що ми заблизько до лінії фронту, але у нас залишаються діти, і ми не можемо зробити укриття у нашому дитячому садку. Тому тут теж виникає запитання, наскільки глобально локалізувати ми готові цю допомогу на тих територіях, де національні організації і тим паче INGOs туди просто не підуть через ситуацію безпекову, а люди там залишаються. Тому це більше не питання, це таке собі стейтмент для рефлексії про те, наскільки локально, відповідно до регіонального розташування, ми готові йти з організаціями там, де більші, можливо, більш sustainable, можливо, більш спроможні організації, туди вони просто не підуть. Але, знову ж таки, дуже велике вам дякую за цю презентацію і дуже рада, що ми з вами працюємо в одному полі для того, щоб успроможнювати маленькі організації на місцях. Дякую.
Great, thank you very much. So, in essence, an observation about the granularity of localization, particularly in frontline communities, and micro-targeting of funding coming through. I'm presuming that in your study that may have been too difficult to locate inside of the data, but do you have some observations?
I can give just a quick thought. So just briefly, because we do a lot of work with coalitions of local actors, and one of the conversations that we have with them all the time, and my colleague Chalande, who's from Kenya, says this to me on a weekly basis, they have to keep regrounding in their community. Every time our coalition actors become competitive with each other, she says to them, what does your community say that they need? And it's such a leveler because part of the responsibility is also going to be for you guys who are national NGOs to let go of power and funding as the system evolves, right? And to actually take yourselves out of the picture in order to let more funding go to local like truly grassroots, down to micro grants. And I know, Liz, you've had a lot of experience, and both Lizzies, with using SCLR, which is an approach for getting micro grants to communities specifically for this reason. But I think in all of this, we cannot lose sight of exactly what you've just pointed out. It is so critical if we're going to create an even playing field. Otherwise, we just create entrenched power dynamics within the system. I don't know if any of you guys wanted to say anything, or just, yeah? Oh, you got multiple mics.
I only need one. Just a really brief point to say. I worked on a research program funded by ECHO called Accelerating Localization Through Partnerships. It included research in 4 countries, including conflict-affected countries. And interestingly, in those contexts, localization was more increased where communities or areas were insecure, because generally international NGOs have lower risk appetite, and therefore often it's the local organizations, the community-based organizations, which I think is what you're all saying, right? But yes, there is some evidence for that. I don't think necessarily in your study or in Ukraine, but in global studies that's true. And it's less about shifting power, right? It's more about, well, we can't go there, it's not safe for us, so we will grant on to local organizations who are prepared to.
And push the risks to them, yeah.
And transfer risk. So, okay, thank you very much. Any other questions? We're coming great. Maybe we'll go a little bit beyond time.
Hi, Alice Hooper, donor, and well noted on the recommendations aimed at us. I work for the British Embassy here in Kyiv, and I have been working very closely with all of you, so I think what I'm going to say isn't going to be so much of a surprise. But I was very encouraged that the UHF made this data available in the first place, and I think they should really be commended for that, because there isn't a lot of transparency on the level of detail that's being provided here, and that benefits some actors and doesn't benefit others. And I think this is the type of study where I really see the impact in the conversation that I have with headquarters. Like, this will ripple, and this will be a conversation that happens beyond Ukraine. And that's important because the solutions to some of these challenges aren't going to come from here. They're not going to come from inside Ukraine. They're not going to come from any of the donors, INGOs, UN agencies in Kyiv. It's going to come from the headquarters level. And it's going to come from global shifts on these policies rather than individual exceptions that are made for Ukraine. So I think that, yeah, so grateful for this study. I think it's potentially some uncomfortable reading for some people and actors, and I think that's exactly what it should be, to then generate a conversation about, well, what comes next? I do have a question, and it is on risk. And one of the conversations that I've had to engage with occasionally when we've tried to localize our assistance in Ukraine is, oh, but if we're working with local actors, isn't that risky? And there's global evidence that that's not inherently true. And I think there's a developing conversation here about risk sharing instead of risk transfer, and that's as much on us as it is on partners to demonstrate where they've gotten to with that. But I wonder if I could ask for some reflections from the panel. How do you see risk in Ukraine, and how do we take this forward together?
Great question. Who wants to start?
I want to start. Я хочу почати. Я хочу почати з реального прикладу, із яким ми стикнулися про ріск-шерінг або ріск-трансферінг в нашій роботі з пул-фандом. Коли ми заключаємо контракт, ми бачимо, що заключали контракт з нашим партнером, то ми бачили, що вся відповідальність за роботу наших грантів, тим, кому ми видаємо фінансування, на нас. Тобто ми маємо за призначенням, не витратили їх на те, що не можна витрачати, і все інше. Але при цьому ми зовсім не гнучкі в тому, щоб тоді організовувати роботу з цими гранті самостійно. Тобто нам дають, по-перше, протокол, як ми маємо з ними працювати, і при цьому ми все одно за них повноцінно відповідальні. І це про риск-трансферінг, який ми відчули на собі, організовуючи пул-фанд. І коли ми почали працювати над контрактом, який ми маємо заключати з локальними організаціями, то нам теж просили включити певну передачу відповідальності на локальні організації. Хоча ми вже на цьому моменті просили, що давайте ми все ж таки будемо ділити ризики з локальними організаціями і включати більше все ж таки взаємодії згідно українського законодавства і робили вже договір відповідно до українських норм.
Great, thank you very much. Any other observations? Do you want to?
So, since you've pointed out this study is slightly uncomfortable, I'll go ahead and be provocative. In the countries where I've had access to risk registers, this is not a lot of countries, but we are consistently seeing in the countries where I've had the data that there are the same number of local organizations clearing the safest level of risk classification as there are INGOs and UN. That's point one. Point two, when we look at how the projects are implemented, it is almost entirely local organizations who are doing all of the implementation anyway. So, A, you're putting them at more risk because they're on the front lines, but B, the idea that somehow the UN or the INGO project is less risky from an operational perspective doesn't make a whole lot of sense because the local actors are doing all of the operations anyway, for the most part. That's not always true, but a lot of the time. Final point, which is the more provocative point, is when we look, this is a point that we have raised with a lot of individual country missions. If you look at the findings, 25% of funds to local organizations over the last year and this year, 25%, the UN and the INGOs are still operating 75% of the funding, would yield $256 million in cost efficiencies. That's your price of covering risk. It's a mighty expensive price to pay for covering risk. We have got to find a way to have a more sensible conversation around what risk really looks like. It's a real issue. I'm not saying that it doesn't need to be considered very, very carefully. But as with all of this, the conversation is so unbalanced at the minute, and it doesn't make a whole lot of sense. So I think we've got to really call it out as a really honest conversation and challenge some of our notions of what we mean when we start to talk about risk.
Thank you.
І мені здається, коли ми говоримо про те, що ризики мають певну ціну, ми маємо говорити про те, що, добре, ця дата, яку ми сьогодні розглядали, про cost efficiency, вона для організацій, які вже працюють в Україні. Так? Тобто вони вже створили свій офіс і витратили на це певні гроші. Але якщо порівняти, скільки коштує міжнародній організації відкрити офіс в Україні, і скільки коштує ризики для донора почати працювати з українською організацією, а де тут буде cost efficiency все ж таки?
Good question.
Thanks. And just to add on what you were saying, Courtenay, I think one of the things that always comes to mind when we're looking at the sort of really community level where you're giving really, really small grants out to people, like that you were mentioning that you do and that Caritas does, and I know that you do when we do survivor and community-led response. And I think, to me, there's other risks besides financial risk. There's a risk of not lining up with what there's a risk of not being physically able to listen because you aren't from the place and you have just dropped in from New York and you don't know what you're even looking at. So those risks also exist. And I always feel, especially with micro grants, that we're in a place now that maybe we were with cash a million years ago to individuals where people were like, well, they'll just spend that cash on beer and cigarettes. And we sort of, people used to really say that. And now we're talking about giving $3,000, $10,000 micro grants to communities who live in the community, who are going to be in the community tomorrow. So if they go and buy a canoe with your micro grant, then the whole community is going to know, and the accountability is built in at that level. And so I think there's also has to be a bit of a conversation about, I think from the international level, our inbuilt assumption that local actors are risky, when actually they have accountability built in sort of from within their communities where they're working every day.
Thank you for that. I think we're actually coming close to time. And so before we go to a final lightning round about any key points people want to make on the panel, are there any last questions? Sure.
Thank you very much, colleagues. My name is Martin, and I work here in Ukraine to reflect on the area-based coordination, so working with the HCT Noblali, a humanitarian country team, and to think about how can we complement that JAS coordination with a more locally led coordination. And I've also worked previously on localization for some NGO-led pool funds, so I have some observation that I would like to share with you. So I think that one of the things that I've heard, so several pieces, one on the kind of local and national organization work where basically international organization cannot go because of insecurity. If I can say so, I think that it's kind of a tricky starting point because it's kind of bring an antagonism between international and national NGOs, rather that Courtenay pointed out in the presentation, what we are looking at is the complementarity. And this is the basis on which the international humanitarian assistance has been set, the complementarity of factors. So I think it's really important. Looking at this, and from that starting point, complementarity and also sharing the risk, then sharing the risk is not about security. Sharing the risk is also about some of the risks were mentioned, but the link is also with some of the functions that cost a lot in it, which is the due diligence for all the things. So the risk approach is also the one of, unfortunately, the one that we have seen growing bigger and bigger and bigger over the past 20 years. So it's not getting any simpler, but we ask for more in terms of due diligence. And so what we do, if we use also to work through intermediaries, because no one has the bandwidth, notably to deal with $300 grants for how many associations registered in Ukraine? 30,000, I think, something like this. So we cannot handle, or if we do this, we need intermediaries, those who will do that job. And this is also, you need to pay for that because it's a lot of work. So starting from there, then if you go back to the donors will also ask you some minimum kind of guarantee, and you kind of transfer those on your partners, and you will ask them also to be able to kind of comply with this. So one of the things would be to look at the cost of those due diligence and have the conversation there. And one last point, please. We are speaking right now, and that's great to see the humanitarian fund globally, 37% of the humanitarian funds in the world, country-based pool fund, directly to local actors, or indirectly, both. So that's great. That's really a great vehicle for that. But one of the elements is that the money that we are speaking about is the overseas development assistance. And so that's those 0.7% that the DAC countries, so the Western countries, have agreed upon taking out of their global what is the GNA, gross national product or something like this, to put into overseas development assistance. But here, we are speaking about a very smaller part of this humanitarian assistance. It's about 10% of those. It's not even 0.7, I think it's 0.3%. So it's just blah, 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 blah. So we are having that conversation about a share of the money which is really, really limited, and which is also the one we have the largest, I would say, requirements in terms of due diligence. So maybe we would like also to expand the scope and to look at how the funding mechanism, which the different donors also have, and that are much more flexible, and they have already passed 10 years ago, 20 years ago, that milestone of 25%. And from what I see, we are discussing within the humanitarian response here about also getting those funds, because it is lacking. We need also this. So I think that we need to work on both sides, not only on the humanitarian fund to make them more flexible, which is great, quality funding, fair partnership, but also to look at, okay, where is the money? Because working on cost efficiency on the very small part of the money, maybe we would look at where is the big pot. That's what I wanted to say. Thank you very much for your attention, colleagues.
Thank you. Excellent points. Okay, why don't we go to a final lightning round if people have any final comments. Who would like to start?
Okay, 3 points, I think. One, if you're UN, donor, INGO, put it in your policy that you will share ICR. 2, read the risk-sharing framework that's been developed by a working group of the Grand Bargain, because that answers some of those questions we were just talking about, which includes security, risk, fiduciary, reputational, all the various aspects of risk. And 3, could the Ukraine Humanitarian Fund keep doing the great work it is doing? Let's celebrate that, but continue to strive to transfer more funds, a higher percentage of funds, to local and national actors in Ukraine.
Great start, thank you. I agree with that, and I think one of the key takeaways for me was in the research, and also another reminder is about the lack of transparency in the system and lack of accountability in the system as well. I really hope that we are responsive to that evidence, and to some of the unpleasant things that we've read, because also we know the tendency to have research, to have evidence, and then lack of response or lack of action to that. So it is really important for me to also have some something coming out of this in terms of systems and shifting the power and all of these things. Yeah, I understand that it's very difficult, and I understand that there are actors that are resistant to this, but I don't think people coming with a certain set of values into humanitarian system have other options. Really, it's very important we do not just close our eyes on this. Yeah.
One small thing, data gaps that we still have. I think this is so exciting because of what it illuminates, even if only for the UHF in Ukraine. We have data on the funding flows flowing directly to local NGOs. We don't have any data on, any global data on pass-through. How much of the global funding flows are actually going to an INGO, then going to a local NGO, or going to a UN agency, and then going to a local NGO? We don't know that. Donors, we don't know that. We would love to know, because we can't measure it. If we can't measure it, we can't get better, because we don't know where we're at. So that, to me, would be a big ask.
У мене, напевно, заклик і прохання до міжнародних громадських організацій, національних, локальних організацій і донорів. Давайте почнемо бути прозорими один перед одним. Нам те, заради кого ми працюємо, люди, яким ми хочемо допомагати, починають втрачати певну довіру до нас. І це через те, що ми недостатньо відкриті, ми не публікуємо наші звіти. В Україні ми зі своєю мережею, на своєму прикладі, ми намагаємося це транслювати. Але це має відбуватися зі всіма. Бо ця непрозорість, вона негативно впливає на всіх. І нам потрібна прозорість вже сьогодні. І це до всіх, це не до когось конкретно. Нам реально треба всім стати більш прозорими.
So final words. The reason I became an economist when I was 18 years old, I decided I wanted to be an economist, was because I recognized that when you put numbers to something, it changes the conversation. And that has shown through every time I've done one of these types of studies. I think, one of the common responses to this study is we knew this, but seeing the numbers on paper changes the conversation. I'm going to go back to my colleague Chilande in Kenya, who we started a set of conversations with bilateral donors, INGOs, local actors, and other partners maybe 4 years ago. And she started the very first conversation by saying, would everybody in this room please strip away your labels, strip away your British Embassy or your US aid or your Caritas or your R2P or whoever you may be, and recognize that everybody in that room, and I apply that to this room here, wants to see the system change. So please have honest conversations with each other about how we move this forward, because in my experience, everybody, donors, UN, INGOs, there are a lot of people who want to see this change, but we all face realities that constrain us. And it's only if we're really honest about what those constraints and barriers are that we can start to shift them. So I would hope that that would be what this study will spur for the conversation here in Ukraine, but also in other countries where we're working.
Courtenay, thank you so much for a really extraordinary report, for the, really shining a light on some data and some ideas and some concepts that we all knew were out there, but just hadn't been able to see before. So thank you so much for that. And panelists, thank you for both a really smart and a robust and a solutions-focused conversation. Because given what's on the table here, there's a lot of room in which we could have gone with the conversation. I really appreciate where it went. So thank you all very much. Appreciate it.